that most prominent books that have informed of the political Islam have usually skipped over Salafism and have often confused it with offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. For instance, one of the most important books on the early Islamic movements, of course, written by Gilles Kepel, The Prophet and the Pharaoh, does not mention Salafism and its basic doctrines. In his last chapter, he portrays at some length the activities of the pious student movement, the Jama'at. He describes how piety became increasingly important and students demanded mosques at the universities and asked for a division between sexes. Of course, he analyzes Sayyid Qutb and his by now famous book, Milestones. But he analyzes these mostly in connection with violence, but he does not relate it to Salafism at all. Throughout his book, elements of Salafism are mentioned, but they are not analyzed in a coherent fashion, and relations with its elements remain vague. In the end, Salafism movement leads to violence, while the Muslim Brotherhood, which he also, of course, analyzes in his book, accepts the status quo and becomes pragmatic. In Kepel's book, The Brotherhood actually forms a new capitalist Islam that derives from Saudi Arabia, not Salafism. So what is the relation actually between the quest for doctrinal purity, piety, rigid doctrines, and separation of sexes, and violence? And is there a relationship? In this lecture, I want to concentrate on the relationship between Salafism and politics. By politics, I mean the art of achieving the possible and reaching results with others who may adhere to another ideology to reach certain well-defined goals that are believed to belong to the common good. Salafism is defined as an attempt to emulate the Prophet and the first generations of Muslims, who are regarded as exemplary and who should be followed, often literally. This means that in doctrine, the first 3 generations are believed to have been the most exemplary Muslims who submitted themselves completely to the will of God. In doctrine, Salafism means that the distance between God and man is the largest, and human agency is actually the lowest. I will explain this later. Man is subjected to the will of God. His actions are geared to following his will, and his will can be found in the sources of Islam, the Quran and the Hadith. It is for this reason that Hadith are so important for Salafis. This, I think, is crucial for the matter I want to explain. The rule of thumb is actually the following. The more attention for purity in human conduct and the absolute, the greater the focus on doctrine, the less political the movement is. This does not mean that actions of the movement does not have political consequences. All actions of humans and human movements have political implications, but that they are not always spelled out in political terms. Rejecting politics in the end can lead to condoning the ruler, even if he is a despot, or the opposite, to killing of the ruler. This leads to the paradox of Sayyid Qutb, that the greatest freedom of man from tyranny is the subjection to God. I will argue that both are 2 sides of the same coin, because the third way is accepting human frailty, incompleteness, and the ways to achieve the best is by means of compromise, to rise up to make demands that are based on rights. It was no accident that Salafi-inspired movements killed Sadat in 1981, neither is it an accident that Salafism was not on Tahrir Square a year ago to bring down Mubarak. To be sure, the Salafis in Egypt later on did arrive in Tahrir and even dominated the square for one of the Friday manifestations, a memorable one in July last year. But the movement did not participate in the political and social movement during the crucial 18 days that led to the fall of Mubarak. And that is no accident, as I will try to explain. But is the Salafi movement then an opportunistic movement, which waits until the right moment to start action? Are they in fact what they accuse others of being the munafiqun, the hypocrites? This is also not the case. When studying Salafis, we should be beware of trying to make stereotypes and fit them in fixed patterns. It is difficult actually to pin them down. For instance, one of the most vehement opponents of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces at the moment is Sheikh Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, who is a presidential candidate. There are 2 reasons why it is difficult to fix Salafism into categories. The first is that Salafism suffers from a lack of political theory, which forces it to borrow from outside doctrine. The second is that it suffers from internal contradictions. The major one is that while it is strongly activist, on the other hand, it accepts authority and hierarchy. And both of these things are important for both the Middle East and for Europe. So let us look at the doctrine. Of course, everybody who studied Salafism for a bit knows that Tawheed is actually the most important doctrine, part of the doctrine. Actually, the whole doctrine of Salafism is extremely powerful. Bernard Haeckel, who is a specialist on Salafism, calls it a muscular doctrine. Together it forms a total Islamic program, or manhaj. To put it simply and briefly, because I won't go too deep into it, because I'm mostly interested into the political dimensions of Salafism, the concepts around which the movement revolves is, first of all, the concept of Tawheed, the oneness of God. Tawheed is the central concept in Salafism. It is the basis of its doctrine. This is the ultimate transcendence of God, that Muslims should worship God alone. This translates itself into an abhorrence, of course, of shirk, giving associates to God. For instance, Ibn al-Wahhab condemned veneration of trees and chopped down sacred trees in the 18th century in the Arabian Peninsula. As a result of the doctrine of Tawheed, the movement is highly intolerant to any form of change, which is condemned as bid'ah. Bid'ah is a crucial element of Salafism, or unlawful innovation. It is also critical of other Islamic currents. Ibn al-Wahhab condemned, for instance, the worship of shrines and demolished the mausoleum that was erected above the grave of one of the companions of the Prophet near where he lived. Sufis, for instance, are called kuburiyun, the grave worshippers. Saudi Arabia follows this doctrine and demolished even the mausoleum of the Prophet Muhammad. Shiites are called rawafid, the rejectors, because they do not recognize the first three rightly guided caliphs, of course, who were also three important figures of the first three generations during and after the Prophet Muhammad. So actually in itself, Salafism looks like a sect by regarding themselves as a chosen group, al-firqa al-najiyah. Actually, the only believers that will go to heaven. As part of this intolerance, Salafism condemns all forms of change as deviation, which must not only be condemned, but must also be banned as unbelief. Takfir is part of the practice of Salafism, but also another less drastic principle is here at stake. Injunction of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, promoting the good and condemning the bad, or for short, Hizbah. This can be done by the hand, the tongue, and the heart. We might come to that another doctrine is that of wala wa bara, which is also crucial to Salafism. The doctrine of loyalty and disavowal. Loyalty to their own group and disavowal of all those outside that group. And do not belong to the chosen sect. Finally, Salafism also does not accept the different schools of jurisprudence, the madhahib. Muslims should go directly to the sources of Islam and study Quran and Hadith. So let's look at the contradictions within this element, within the doctrine of Salafism. The major contradiction is that all of these elements of the Salafi doctrine have strong activist and sometimes even democratic implications. They urge Muslims to be active in spreading the means of faith by means of dawah, and preventing the bad by, first of all, embracing Hizbah and promoting the good, of course. The original doctrine is of Hizbah is, of course, what we would call civil duty. One has to take responsibility for one's own activities and activities of others and correct their conduct. Takfir, of course, is also quite an activist in its original form, and it is a practice of condemning others. Above all, the Salafi injunction to go directly to the sources and acquire religious knowledge, ilm, has democratic implications, as we know in Europe, of course, where Protestantism basically did the same during the Reformation, that people should read the Bible themselves. These energizing rules and practices, however, are overlaid by a politically conservative doctrine, which basically goes back to the original agreement between Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud. This is the doctrine of Wali al-Amr, obedience to the ruler. although it's not quite clear.